Unit 6 Speech, Understanding of Memory and Communication, Structures and Processes Involved in Interaction and Production of Memory. Memory is a complex process that ensures us to successfully learn information and recall it in order to live our lives. Many scientists have studied memory, and there are still many things that we need to learn about memory. Memory has been often studied in cases where a person has had brain injury or surgery. By examining these damages and the effects of a loss of memory or learning capacity, the brain functions have been understood better. The brain areas are involved in memory are the hippocampus, the amygdala, and thalamus. And there are 3 stages we know: encoding, consolidation, storing, and retrieving of information. Processing information into memory is called encoding or learning. Encoding may be stored in 3 memory systems: sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory. Sensory memory may be immediate, and it has a huge capacity. However, that information is not processed. Some examples of sensory memory may be iconic and echoic memory. Some information in sensory memory gets stored in short-term memory, which has a narrow capacity. It's only stored for less than 60 seconds, and if the memory is retained, it may become a long-term memory. Retrieval of information is the process of retrieving memory by using cues. The stimuli that helps the process, which are associations, context, and mood. Sensory is classified based on the length of time. Sensory memory is 1 second. Short-term memory is less than a minute. Long-term memory is a lifetime. And then there's also declarative memory, episodic memory, cinematic memory, and non-declarative memory. According to psychology, there are 4 types of learning. There's stimulus response, which has classical conditioning and operant conditioning. And then there's motor learning, perceptual learning, and relational learning. Learning involves cortical sensory, and subcortical processes. Brain structures involved in memory are the amygdala. The role of the amygdala is an important player in classical conditioned emotional response after receiving the information from the auditory cortex. The lateral nucleus of the amygdala is activated. At the same time, the nucleus receives sensory input, and the 2 sources of information merge together and one associates with another. The synaptic changes happen which result in learning. Lateral nucleus has neurons that has axons reaching to the central nucleus. Terminal buttons form synapses with dendritic spines. As a result, the neurons start firing and activates neurons inducing the role response, unconditioned response. The role of the basal ganglia, information from transcortical cortical pathways is transferred by the basal. I'm sorry, I don't think I'm pronouncing it right. Let me see 1 second. Basal ganglia. The basal ganglia basal ganglia. So behavior becomes automatic. The cauda and putamen receive an impulse from the frontal lobe about movement. The impulse carries information and goes to the globus pallidus, continuing to the premotor and supplementary motor cortex. On the end, the finning goes to the primary motor cortex, where the behavioral response gets initiated. So the basal ganglia is in charge of learning automatic motor behaviors, and then the extra straight cortex is responsible for short-term visual memory. Ventral stream fusiform face area is activated to memorize face and place. The parahippocampal place area is activated to memorize places. The prefrontal cortex may be responsible in activating the mesmobolic pathways to achieving the goals. The primary motor cortex is accomplishing motor behaviors, and by assistance from premotor cortex and supplementary motor area, it enhances motor learning. Prefrontal cortex is also involved in short-term memory. This region screens, manipulates, and organizes the information and selects relevant info that needs to be stored. And then perceptual visual memory happens in pathways of dorsal and ventral streams. It happens as a consequence of synaptic connections changing in sensory association cortex. The hippocampus is consisted of dentate gyrus and subregions. The neurons have axons that end in dentate gyrus and subregions. When the brain is in a relation learning process, the hippocampus receives information from sensory and motor cortex and subcortex areas. After the information is released and consolidated, it is stored there for later retrieval. Remember that remembering in its context and order that happened. Dorsal hippocampus shuts off, remembering in its context and order that happened. Dorsal hippocampus shuts off this process, and in the brain injury of this area, it is evident that the processes do not occur. In the anterolateral lobe is the area where the somatic memory is stored. And then the research has shown that the synaptic connections strengthen when long-term learning happens. Learning affects presynaptic changes in synapses and production of neurotransmitters. Learning involves cortical and sensory and subcortical processes memory, and depends on interaction of different parts of the brain in order to process information, analyze it, classify, and store it in compartments of the brain. Retrieval of that memory depends on a way that the memory is stored. Environmental influences in memory and learning process. Sensory receptors assist us to learn about our environment, and often our life depends on it. Different stimulus are received and changed into the electrochemical impulses throughout our nervous systems. When the stimulus are received, the sensory neurons fire electrical impulses and changes the membrane of that sensory neuron and produce action potential, which is carried into the central nervous system. At that point, the impulses are integrated with other information of same or other kinds, and it becomes the impulses that are becomes the perception of that stimuli. Humans have two types of responses of communication systems: endocrine and nervous systems. These two systems regulate human body with the help of chemical and electrochemical signals with the help which will help the information in combine memory and learning experiences. During sleep, the human brain stores memory, and this state promotes translation of information needed for memory consolidation. The research indicates that sleep evidently influences the oscillation of molecule synaptic strength, and firing rates, which is the indicator of regulation of neural activity, which affects memory processes. Communication on a neurological level. To be able to communicate with people must first be capable to understand that something needs to be communicated. That means people must be able to perceive information. The occipital, temporal, and parietal lobes, sorry, they're a little complicated to pronounce, are activated with perception is occurring, and memory of those events are retrieved. Very important area for communication is the Broca's area, which is located in the left frontal lobe on the edge of the motor cortex. This area also controls the muscles that are used in speech and are used in language and speech creation. The Wernicke's area is found on the left hemisphere of the brain. However, to comprehend language and meaning of words, the use of the right hemisphere of the brain is necessary. Bilingual people have separate areas for specific languages. Also, they have a specific area that is used for both languages. Areas in the frontal and posterior cortex are identified to be used in language, as well as the subcortical structures of the brain by studying people who had damage in this part of the brain. Scientists learned and identified areas that are active when people communicate. However, that research study indicates that brain plasticity is enormous, and even if the brain area that is responsible for certain tasks is damaged, the brain is capable to develop capacity in adjacent areas and serve the same purpose. That's why therapy may be very helpful in remediate communication skills and abilities in people.